Well, welcome, folks. It's November 14th, 1991, and we're at the Valentine-Varian house in the Bronx. The Bronx Historical Society has placed on exhibition here some very interesting material on Bronx libraries and also high schools. But in this room, we have the libraries are being featured. Certainly, libraries date far back, and as we all know, they were very primitive places originally. Might have been just a room in a schoolhouse or even a private library in some wealthy man's home. The kaleidoscope of the styles of library and who ran them and why they existed makes a very colorful and interesting story. I think what we will see here is a beginning of that and a broad aspect of most of the facets of that story. If you'd like to come over to the side of this room, we will attempt to see what's on exhibition here today. Yes, folks, now here we have a early engraving, and it depicts the reception hall of the Governor Morris Mansion. And as mentioned, the first libraries in the Bronx were private, as was the case of the Bronx's first European settler, Jonas Bronx, who brought 38 books on religion, navigation, and history, comprised of the largest collection in New Netherland. Such groups and collections grew over the years, and with the various prominent settlers and family bringing with them, in many cases from Europe, these wonderful written books and reference material, it was the seed and the basis for the entire library system as we know it today. Going down further here, we see a later library, which is the Hunts Point branch in the 1930s. So you can see the contrast from the private living room in a mansion and perhaps an offset room to a public library frequented by many, many people, where consequently the private collections were hardly open to the public at all. They were very private and very selective in who was able to read them. Let's move over here a little. Another photo. Now we've gone from the original library setting to that one in the 30s and 20s, and here we have one, the Riverdale Branch Library, which is taken in 1954, and it shows an A-frame style modern building. So we have that, shows you the entire scope that the system and the housing for the library system has changed over the years. Even though many old branch libraries exist in their old form, this is what we've been dealing with. And of course today they have climate control and preservation and all the things that were not present years ago. After 1895, when the New York City public library system was established, we can see how things change. This next frame will indicate that. We have another contrast in the operation of libraries. It's a mobile motorized library, which is in fact a bus converted to a portable library, and this brought the libraries to remote areas. Matter of fact, as a young man in the 40s, I used to patronize such libraries in the Clawson Point section, where there were no official library buildings. And bookmobiles, they were called, and these were sent around on schedule to areas, and the public had an adequate opportunity to utilize that system. It was very successful. I do not see it anymore today. I don't know why. Here we have another example and variation. It's the Westchester Square Branch Library. It's located at Glebe and Overling Avenue. Now here's what might be considered a semi-modern building from the 50s. And oddly enough, in Westchester Square in 1890s, Huntington, Hartford, Collis P. Huntington had a private library, and he donated it to the city and the township. And they didn't have the funds to support the old Huntington Library. So even today, it's a private library and in a very ancient building. In that library also housed books from the Indian Museum of the City of New York. So the variations are manifold, and When you think of how many millions of books have been printed and preserved, you can see the scope of opportunity to operate a library. Here we have another form. We have an interesting building. It's the High Bridge Branch Library at 168th Street and Shakespeare Avenue. That's a phenomena to have a library located on Shakespeare Avenue. Someone could write something on that. This would be near the Harlem River, and as we all know, the Bronx is full of hills and valleys, and this is not commonly known, but perhaps libraries should all be placed on the top of the hill. It seems appropriate in my estimation. But it's an interesting building, and you can notice the old large picture windows, which allowed quite a bit of light to come in. In the older buildings, originally the gas lamps and the early electric lamps were not that bright, so this was necessary. And again, it's a beautiful building with a nice lawn and shrubbery, and I'm sure it was a pleasure just to go there, and hopefully a pleasure to examine all the contents.
The middle one.
You know, they're both hybrid. I'm surprised. Did they tear that down and build this?
What are the dates on that?
Well, that's 30 and 33.
So
They must have torn that down and built this. Well, I won't comment on that.
Okay,
I'll just say here we have an interior view of the children's reading room in the High Bridge branch in 1933. It's very homey in that it has a fireplace, and it appears the fireplace is used because it has blackened smoke in it. The armchairs, the captain chairs, are very comfortable, and I suppose it took a special effort to contain young people's emotions and noise in a library setting. So I suppose they set aside a children's room for their own type of reading material and to control them better. I don't know if that's being done today anymore, but it certainly is a pleasant atmosphere to learn. Here we have an interesting newspaper clipping. It mentions spectators at the groundbreaking ceremony in 1977 for the Belmont Library, the Enrico Fermi Cultural Center. Now, as most of you may know, Belmont is an Italian neighborhood, so-called. And the ethnic diversity which you find in much of the city is concentrated here in one neighborhood, but predominantly Italian. Most of the Bronx had its Jewish neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, and Irish neighborhoods, but rarely did the libraries reflect that ethnic diversity. But in Belmont, they seem to have managed to make this an Italian library, so to speak, with an Italian name and an atmosphere. I think that says a lot for their efforts and the fact that we shouldn't forget our heritage and keep it alive in our libraries. Here's another one of our valuable collection in the Bronx Historical Society, and yet, even though it's valuable, it reflects something happened in 1985. It's the opening of the new Eastchester Branch Library on Gun Hill Road. Again, we see now changes in design and atmosphere in a library setting. Oddly enough, the gargoyles of the lion and the other materials reflect older things, but it certainly seems to be a beautiful and substantial building. And we go down here to, no, that's below. Again, one person is seen entering, and I'm surprised at the narrow door, which doesn't seem to be common in libraries. There seem to be wider doors, but I suppose that was a design aimed at. We have a more human aspect of libraries, and I'll read it. It says, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the opening of the Parkchester Branch Library in June of '85. From left to right, we see Dr. Vartan Gregorian, president of the New York Public Library. Bronx Borough President Stanley Simon, Lillian Schulman, President Library Support, New York City Councilman Michael DeMarco, the tall fellow, and New York State Senator Joseph Gallagher and Lillian Lopez, Library Coordinator of Branch Libraries. Oddly enough, this library was built right just about underneath the Westchester Avenue L. I was surprised thinking that the noise would affect, the tranquility of the library. But it seems the construction of the building and all that, it's hardly noticeable when you're in that library, as I've been, to notice any distraction from the L train. Again, it's an example of what can be done, and the interior courtyard, the entranceway are all unique in library design. Thank you very much. My name's Arthur Seifert, Bronx historian.
Right? This is the cemented. Now they got people right there. What is the eye? On the other side is the same level.
Watching Beach from years, from 6 months old to 15 years old, I lived in Watching Beach. I told you.
This is Lloyd Altan speaking, and we are now looking at a photograph of the West Farms branch of the New York Public Library. Now this photograph has something that has some very historic connotations for the Bronx County Historical Society. The West Farms branch of the library was dedicated in 1954, and 1 year later, in 1955, the very first meeting of the Bronx County Historical Society took place at the West Farms branch. It was chosen because it was the most centrally located branch of the library, where people from every neighborhood could get to by public transportation very easily. The very first meetings of the Historical Society took place there. The officers were elected. The Constitution was hammered out. Application was made for a charter. And all during the times of we were at the West Farms branch. Then what happened was that we grew too big, and we moved out to the main branch of the New York Public Library in the Bronx, which is the Fordham branch on Bainbridge Avenue. We have another photograph of that elsewhere in this, but now we're going to go on to another photograph and see a different branch of the library. This is the Kingsbridge branch library. A photograph was taken about 1915, which is about 10 years after the library opened its doors. It was a very, very small branch located on Kingsbridge Avenue. It, however, served its purpose very, very well, but as the population of the Kingsbridge area began to grow, this library got to be too small. So finally, in January of 1959, the library moved to new and better quarters, but at least this photograph preserves, for history, what the first branch, Kingsbridge Branch Library of the New York Public Library looked like. The photograph shows the interior of the old Kingsbridge Branch Library about 1940. You can see that the shelves are well stacked, and you can also see that it is well used. For even in this tight space that's inside, you could see there are about 7 or 8 people in a very small space using that library. It's one of the reasons why a new branch and a larger branch had to be built. The Morrisania Branch Library, which is located on 169th Street, very close to McKinley Square. The Morrisania Branch Library is one of those libraries that was built with money from the Carnegie Fund, established by Andrew Carnegie to build public libraries in New York City. Again, very heavily used library in its day. The photograph was taken about 1920, and in those days, in order to save money and make the Carnegie Fund go a little further, generally most of the libraries were built in the same general style, so that the same sort of materials would be used and the same specifications would be used in various parts of the library. And you will see some other libraries and other photographs elsewhere that look pretty similar to this, although not exactly precisely the same. Here we have a postcard that shows the Morrisania Branch Library in living color. As you see, it's made of dark red brick with limestone trim. The public libraries were considered extremely important structures, which is one of the reasons why you would get a picture postcard of them and you could use it. And speaking of Morrisania Library, we have 2 people who actually used it, and we're going to see if we can get some of their fond reminiscences of the Morrisania Library. Could you tell us your name and what you remember of the library?
My name is Dolores Lessner. I remember when I was just about 5 years old, my mother took me from my first library card and walking up the marble steps and looking at the head librarian, for whom I worked later in the Melrose Library. And I just spent have fond memories of the many days that I sat in that library.
And Teresa, can you give your name and your memories?
Oh, I'm Teresa Lato. I was a student at PS 40 and used the Morrisania Library. I was commended by the librarian because I was very careful about protecting the books that I returned, and that was the way my parents brought us up, to respect public property. It was a wonderful library, and PS 40 was a wonderful school.
Thank you very much. Here we have the picture of the Mott branch of the New York Public Library. Photograph was taken in 1911. The building was opened up in 1905. It is the very first branch of the New York Public Library built as a branch of the New York Public Library in the Bronx. It's located on Alexander Avenue and is now part of the Mott Historic District. The important thing about this library is this, too, is a library that was built from the Carnegie funds, and the architect of the building is actually Andrew Carnegie's own personal architect, the man who built his mansion on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. That building is still there, it is still being used, and still highly patronized. Here we have a pamphlet that was distributed by the Circulation Department of the New York Public Library in 1957. It is meant to show the location of all of the branches of the New York Public Library and all of the boroughs that the New York Public Library serves, the Bronx being one of them. You're supposed to open it up and then turn it sideways, and you see that the public library is located all over the Bronx in many different areas. And the symbols of the public library, the triangle, the square, the X in the middle of a square, all are supposed to show the different types of services that each branch is supposed to have. As the New York Public Library grew and with the population, more and more branches had to be built, and old branches were replaced by newer and larger branches. Quite often there are decorations that are placed on those branches. Here is a sculpture that was placed as part of the Grand Concourse branch of the New York Public Library, which was built in 1957 on 173rd Street, just east of the Grand Concourse. And as you see, it has a theme of reading, a mother reading to her child. Very, very cozy, comfortable, and evocative sculpture. A rather unusual photograph. The Fordham Branch Library, which is also known as the Fordham Library Center on Bainbridge Avenue, just north of Fordham Road, is the main library of the New York Public Library in the Bronx. Here we see the very, very beginnings of it as a hole in the ground. This is the excavation for the site of the Fordham Branch Library. The interesting thing about this for the Bronx County Historical Society is that when the Historical Society was moving from the West Farms branch to larger quarters, it moved into this particular branch library, and the meetings took place in the basement, which means, of course, is that the photograph here of the foundation site is the future location for meetings of the Bronx County Historical Society. And this has been a glimpse of just some of the New York Public Library branches that you find in the Bronx and some of its rich history. This is Lloyd Altan. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jake Nixon. This is Byron Jones. Hello.
Sam Zamarinsky.
And we're three of the project directors for the Bronx is Up project. For the week covering October 20th to the 27th, we took part in a photo essay where we had 75 photographers documenting photographically life in the Bronx. I had the opportunity to take pictures in my old Bronx neighborhood and in various places. I had a wonderful time doing it. Here, let Byron speak to you a little bit about what his experience was.
I also shot for the week. I even took off from work and spent my days roaming around the Bronx photographing. I live in the Parkchester area of the Bronx, and I shot basically in that area. I shot the St. Raymond's Church located on the corner of Tremont Avenue and Castle Hill. I took interior shots as well as exterior shots. I also photographed in Pelham Bay Park. I photographed the stables. I was over in City Island on the docks around sunset. I also traveled to the Throgs Neck area and photographed Fort Shula pretty much at sunset. I photographed the fort and the coastal lighthouse located at the tip of the Bronx. And now I'll turn this over to Sam Zimerinsky.
Well, my week consisted of shooting some scenes at the St. Anne's Church, which is, I believe, one of the oldest churches in the Bronx, or the oldest church. I had a fantastic enlightenment of what goes on in that area, besides being involved with the church. We did some beautiful shooting in there, and some of the photos that I've received back already were taken as very good, right?
Definitely.
Okay. I've also had quite an experience of shooting a firehouse and taking out on a fire engine for a fire. I also went to the 40th precinct, and we walked the beat with 2 police officers, which took us around the area, and that was quite an experience. Yankee Stadium and other areas of the Bronx.
Tell them about inside the locker room at Yankee Stadium.
Well, we looked at Munson's locker, looking at where the ball players meet and before the game and socialize supposedly. And it was quite an experience walking around the stadium without anybody there. All in all, I would say there was a fantastic week of shooting, and I wish I could do it again very shortly.
That's about it. Just wanted to elaborate on the really great times that we all had individually during the shoot. Sam here has a picture of 4 altar boys at St. Anne's Church, and he belongs to PPA, the Pictorial Photographers Association of America. And just to see the reaction of the other club members, he entered this particular photograph into competition, some really tough competition. He was judged by a professional photographer, and I'll let him continue this story. How did your picture do?
It sounds better coming from you, Jay.
He got the top award. When the judge looked at his photograph, he just stopped and said, "I can find no fault with this photograph." It was excellent. It showed the life and the vitality in that community. Most people associate the South Bronx with a lot of terrible things, but there are a lot of great things happening in the Bronx, all over the Bronx. Byron had an experience at, I'll let him tell you.
Yes, I had an experience on the campus of it's called Bronx Community College here in the Bronx. On top of their Tech 2 building, which is considered the highest point in the city of New York. It's in the Kingsbridge Heights section of the Bronx, if I'm correct. Well, on top of this building is where all the police transmittal antennas are located. And we had the opportunity, along with James McCauley, and from that vantage point, you can pretty much see the entire borough, all the way uptown up into Westchester County and as far downtown as the skyline of New York City. And while we were up there, both of us had a very devious thought saying that if we sabotage the transmittal antennas, crime would probably go up in the Bronx at least 25 to 50%. Well, that thought didn't last too long because there's no escape off of the top of that building. But nevertheless, we got some excellent results. Right, it could always throw us off. We used both wide angle and telephoto lenses, and from that vantage point, we were able to pick out isolated historical buildings, Kingsbridge, Armory. We were able to see the Mushroom located on Fordham Road. We were able to see really all the way to the Long Island Sound from that vantage point. So that was quite fantastic.
What did you tell about Jimmy's encounter with
The nun?
with the nuns, yeah, with the convent, yeah.
All right. One of our other project directors, James McCauley, went to a convent. Now, many people don't even realize that we have a convent here in the Bronx, located in Hunts Point. It is very, very beautiful inside. And of course, in a convent, you don't have access all around. He took some pictures, and he met a nun who was a photographer, and she borrowed his camera and went into the convent and took pictures of the inside of this convent, something that the average New Yorker doesn't have an opportunity to see. The average New Yorker doesn't even know that this convent exists. We did things like this during our week in the life of the Bronx. And our photographs are going to show that the Bronx is indeed up, that the Bronx is vital, that the Bronx is alive. And hopefully our pictures will live in perpetuity. I think I said that right, guys.
Sounds correct to me.
Sounds all right? And they'll document what life was like in 1991, October, in the Bronx.
Hi, we're here with a very important guest who probably knows more about the New York Public Library system of the Bronx than anyone else. And I'm going to ask her to introduce herself with a title.
Hi, I'm Melissa Wendt. I am the Associate Director for Bronx Libraries for the New York Public Library. I am responsible for the administration of all the 34 branch libraries of the New York Public Library in the Bronx.
I see. And when you say the administration of the branches of the library, exactly what would that entail?
That entails staff, buildings, and community relations.
I see. Now, approximately offhand, do you know about how many volumes you would find in all of the branches of the public library in the Bronx? Yeah, give me a ballpark figure.
It's probably in the thousands, if not close to 1 million. I really don't have those figures with me, but there are 34 neighborhood libraries in the Bronx in all the different neighborhoods throughout the borough, so we really serve the entire borough.
And of course, not all of these books are just in English. Since you serve the various neighborhoods in the Bronx, I'm sure that there are books in the languages that are predominantly spoken in those areas.
Absolutely. We have a neighborhood service that is directed at the communities in our libraries, and so we look to see who are moving into our neighborhoods. We adjust our collections for that. We have books in Spanish, of course. We have an Italian heritage collection at the Belmont Library, but we also have books in Hindi, in Vietnamese, in Cambodian, in Hungarian, in any language, Russian, that may be spoken by people or read by people in our neighborhoods.
Now, I remember walking into the Soundview branch of the library and finding a whole section devoted to books written in Korean.
Yes. And Classens Point also has a Korean section because there's a Korean population in that neighborhood. So.
I see. Now, do you have any idea of the future of the New York Public Library in the Bronx?
Well, we hope for a good future. Obviously, we are connected to the city. We are a city-funded agency, and we depend upon the city for the bulk of our funding. We have been lucky that we have had a slight budget cut and that our trustees have, for a 2-year period, given us money to supplement. But we're hoping that we can overcome these difficulties and continue. But we have no intention of closing any libraries, and we will maintain as much service as we are able to.
And hopefully we'll continue to do so far into the future.
That's our hope.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is John McNamara. I'm one of the charter members of the Historical Society, and this is the Morris High School exhibit, Governor Morris to be exact. Originally it was supposed to be called the Peter Cooper High School, and then they decided that it would be better to call it Governor Morris because this was his land at one time, and he is a more historic figure than Peter Cooper. What you see here is the enlargement of one of their postcards back about 1957, and I believe it's a little earlier than that because in those days they had a space here for the message. It wasn't on the back along with the postage stamp. And there's just something about, we'll send you a little reminder of Morris High School, and it doesn't tell you who sent it to who or who it was, but GV will never know who it was, but his or her name is recorded for posterity. I'd love to have a calligraphy expert decipher the psyche of this man or woman who wrote it. But as you can see, it's a very beautiful old school, and it was the first one in the Bronx. And these houses here were all private homes. They were all wooden homes with these high-peaked windows, high-peaked steeples on them. They have since been cleared away, and they have a housing project called Forest Houses there. Now this is really a vintage shot of the original building that housed Morris High School. Now I would say, judging by the boy, I would say it's sometime around 1920 at the most. It was at 157th Street and 3rd Avenue on the east side of the street. The building was there the building was there for into the 1940s. By that time, it was a trade school and there was a few other things. Then they finally demolished it and they made a playground out of it. I don't know who the boy is, but if he was alive today, he would be close to 100 years old. Then it was only there a very few years when then Morris High School itself got started. Now, as you see here, this is a stylized cover of the Morris High School journal. It comes out, an annual journal comes out every year. This is they have the model of the school itself. It was a very high scholastic caliber of the school itself, and it was quite a hard time to match it at any other high school at the time. In fact, there were no competing high schools. And from there, you'll get a very nice view of the auditorium. The auditorium was famous in its day. It has an allegorical scene there, and it has a rather idealized idea of the Bronx in those days of Elysian Fields and things like that, and educational hall. I'm sorry to say I don't know who the artist was, but it's been written up a few times. It's been refurbished from time to time. A few times I've looked at it and tried to find if there was any historical significance to it, but I could never do it. I think it was just an allegorical scene of the school. Here you see the Morris High School laboratory as it was in 1905. We tend to think of the turn of the century as being something rather primitive or something, but there's quite an impressive collection of scientific paraphernalia here. That was something very, very new in those days. usually anything of a laboratory was usually of college caliber, and here it was a high school, so that the students were barely 13, 14, and 15 years old, already being exposed to scientific research. And down here, this is very, very interesting from a sociological aspect. You've got the faculty itself, and as you can see, the women teachers were all bareheaded, with the exception of two real individuals who had the wide floppy hats on in those days, very, very fashionable. It was, considering the size of that school, I don't know what the exact population of the school students were, but there's a very impressive number of teachers there. This was the 1904 faculty at the Times. And as you can see, they were pretty well, very, very prim, proper. And I believe in those days, teachers were not allowed to marry. It was frowned upon. That I could be wrong, but yeah. And this one over here is their library. And about the same year, early 1900s, and it's I imagine, of course, right here they have nobody in the seats, but I imagine in regular school hours they have a lot of students there. And this is John McNamara, and thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming here tonight. We're closing this opening of a new exhibition entitled Bronx Libraries, Beacons of Civilization, as well as Morris High School. My name is Joe Connors, and I'm the Educational Coordinator of the Bronx County Historical Society. Thank you and good night.